Flow Designer and Integration Hub today with these guys from ServiceNow. My name is Melissa Fairbrother. I'm also from ServiceNow. I'm our marketing launch manager. I just wanted to let you guys know that if you wanted to check out more stuff that's in London here and know which sessions to go to, just go on our community and search for Start Your Journey. And it'll tell you the remaining sessions that have London capabilities. You can also grab a great pin anywhere in the main product areas on the show floor. So today, just to recap for you, we've got two of our very own here, Harry Nelson and Russ Arbora, part of the CreatorCon breakout. You are now here for Under the Hood of Flow Designer and Integration Hub with the engine developers, and if this is not where you're supposed to be, then now I guess would be the time to go out. We got about 50 minutes. That includes Q&A. It's up to these guys if they want to take them as we go or hold them till the end. And we got mic runners as well, so we'll take care of that for you. Thanks so much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right. So thank everybody for coming. Like Melissa said, I had kind of a fear that there'd be about 10 guys kind of scattered across the back of the room for this talk. So it's nice to see everybody interested in this product, and it's really gratifying when you know that people are using what you're building. So the name of the talk is Under the Hood of Flow Designer, which is kind of a little bit of a weird topic for Flow Designer because it's really meant to be a product for the low-code, no-code developer. And so why would you need to learn what's under the hood? I mean, we hope that you don't need to know what's under the hood, but I think like with any good toy, it's fun to take it apart, and usually you can learn something by doing it, so that's what we're going to try and do today.
Just because London isn't quite out yet, things may change, and there's stuff in here that is part of London. So this is us.
All right, so this is me. I've been here for about just a month over 7 years now. Pretty much all of it spent working on workflow or orchestration. And I mainly focus on kind of the back end of things.
I've been with the ServiceNow for 4 years now, leading workflow, which encompasses the Flow Designer engine for the last 2. Also, primarily back end.
Okay, so the agenda for today is we're going to take like a really high-level look at kind of how we look down on this product and the parts of it. And then we'll drive into a couple areas of that, specifically the design time model, the execution time model, and then how it works on the mid server, which is a new feature in London. If you were familiar with the product in Kingston, it didn't run on the mid server. And we actually have a little bonus section where we're going to run a flow and show you the operations view as well, as long as we have time. All right, so this is kind of how I picture the product. There's really kind of 3 main subsystems to it. There is the authoring tool, which is the Flow or the Action Designer UI tool. And this should be it's the face of the product that you see.
Yeah, it's where you'll build actions that you'll be able to reuse. It's where you'll build the flows and subflows that you'll be doing most of your work out of there. Right.
So it's done in terms of flows and actions and action steps and flow logic. And the reality is that those are design time artifacts. And at runtime, none of that stuff is there. All of that is compiled into the runtime model. And that's what the execution engine actually works on. There's a couple reasons we did that. One is we needed it to run on the mid server, and so we couldn't use the Glide database. If you're familiar with workflow, we wanted this engine to be very, very fast. And workflow is reasonably fast, but it's very data intensive. Like, it's constantly churning through records. It's nonstop. It's hitting the database, querying and updating records. And we didn't want to have to do that in this engine. And then the third thing is we want this to be, or we're hoping that this will be the underlying execution platform for a lot of parts of the platform. Like, basically anywhere you drop into script, we want instead for you to be able to use a Flow Designer flow. And so the idea is there might be other UIs that sit on top of this thing at some point. So the execution part of it is completely independent of the design part of it. And then on the right-hand side, we have kind of the third leg of this thing, which is the operations view or the execution details view. And that is, it's accessed via the authoring tool. It looks like a part of that authoring tool, but really it has its own data model also, and it's worked on by a separate team. Actually, all three pieces of this are kind of worked on by separate teams, and it's really its own kind of standalone thing.
It's akin to the context view of a workflow. So when you looked at the execution of a workflow, you got here's how the workflow executed. But in this case, there's a lot more data involved, a lot more logging. Everything you need to know about how that flow actually executed and progressed data through it is going to be visible within that execution detail view, the operations view as we call it.
Right, and so, like I said, the operations view, it's running on its own data model. And what's happening is the engine, as it executes, is spitting out data. It's reporting out what it's doing. But that data is in terms of this invisible runtime model that you guys don't know about. So the reporting data is all about getting that runtime data and then marrying it back up to the design time artifact so that when we present it to you, it's shown in terms of what you actually designed. And we can say, this is what happened with the things you designed. All right, so if on the left-hand side, we had those Flow Designer artifacts. And when you're in the design tool, there's lots of stuff at play there, right? You've got flows, you've got subflows, you've got actions, you've got action steps, you've got flow logic. So there's a lot of different types of components, but really it boils down to two things, two different flavors. The smallest unit of work that we have in the system is a step, right? And so steps are designed to do one thing very well, and they're supposed to work very fast. Only ServiceNow can create these steps.
And ultimately, that's because they're backed by Java.
Right.
So we have a Java component in the back in our platform that executes that step.
Right. So when you're in the Action Designer, you'll see steps like create a log message, create a record, look up records.
Update records, approvals, wait for tasks, create tasks, the kind of things you expect within the platform.
Right, so those are doing basically one thing. And steps are not allowed to wait in any way. And so what I mean by waiting is there's kind of like two types of waiting. One is synchronous, where like, imagine you have a script and you say, while this condition is not true, gs.sleep for 30 seconds and then check it later.
And please don't do that.
Please do not do that. That is like that is the worst thing that you can do. And we have seen people do that.
A lot.
We've seen people trying to wait days for their integrations to finish.
In a script, just spinning.
So that's what I mean by synchronous waiting. So that's not allowed in a step. But neither is asynchronous waiting, which is where, if you're familiar with like workflow, like in an approval, we create some records, and then we wait for something to happen on those records. And when they're updated, the workflow wakes back up. So that's what I mean by asynchronous waiting. And at the step level, that's not allowed to happen either. So steps are kind of like, they do one thing. If you need more complex functionality than that, that's when you move up to actions or flows or subflows. These are all kind of, in an abstract way, we call them blocks, right? We don't really care whether you call it a flow or a subflow or an action. They all do the same thing. They're basically a chunk of work that's composed from a smaller unit of work. And I'm going to show you a little diagram next. It kind of illustrates how this looks, but the basic idea is just no matter what you're working in, you can think of it in terms of this is actually doing some work, or this is just a holder of the things that do work. Now, there are a couple hybrids. If you look in the Action Designer, you'll see the big three that come to mind are ask for approval, create task, and wait for condition. And if you think about what happens during an approval, it's complicated, right? There's it's not doing one thing at all. So why is that considered a step? Or wait for condition, wait for is in the name of the thing. Why is that considered a step if steps aren't allowed to wait? And the answer is they're not. We actually built those as actions. We just built them in code. So when you guys build actions, it's stored in the database, and that data is used to kind of compile that thing on the fly. We just built these, we hard-coded these in code. And anytime that a flow is assembled from those, that code assembles that block.
The driving factor there was we wanted to give the Action Designer the ability to do some of these things that people consider like, this is a fundamental. I need to be able to create an approval as part of this action.
Right. So we basically tricked the UI into showing an action as a step in that case.
Yes. The actions are when you build an action and you publish it, it is part of an update set. Yes, it's captured in there, as well as flows and subflows. And they're also, for the next question that I feel coming is they're also scoped, so you can put them as part of an application.
All right. So if you think about those kind of two types of components, next we have a little animation here. So this is like a step, and these are the guys that are actually doing work. You can see there's basically no structure around them. Hit the thing, Harry. So if we put that inside of a flow, it basically gets a start and an end wrapped around it. The point, I guess, of this diagram is that at the flow and the action level, they don't do anything. They just hold things that do things, right? It's always the steps that do the work. And we're kind of going to come back to that diagram a little bit later. That's all right.
No, you want to...
What's up? Okay. All right, so knowing this, why did we tell you all this stuff? We wanted to try and give you some guidelines or best practices on how to design your flows, how to design your actions. And I kind of think of this product very much as like we're building a programming language, so these might sound like general programming principles, and we just put kind of a flow designer context on it, and how does it apply in the terms of flow designer. So this first one is basically like single responsibility. As we kind of alluded to before, having a single script action that does a ton of stuff is like the worst thing that you can do. When I think of where are the incidents from this product going to come from, it's going to be from script actions. When you create a script action, if it's more than 10 or 15 lines of code, you should be thinking about breaking it up. The problems that we see with those, when we have upgrade problems, like CJ said this morning, scripts cause upgrade problems. Scripts hide side effects. So what I mean by this is, we've seen this a couple times where there'll be a problem in production, and somebody will go, oh, you know what? If we just add to this advanced approval script, setting this field to this value, it'll fix everything. And then 6 months later, the incident comes in and says, we have no idea, but this field is always getting set to this value and is breaking everything. And then there's a 4-day treasure hunt to try and find out what was setting that field. And then the other problem with scripts, and I got a little example that we'll show next, but really, if your script is more than like 3 lines of code, you're the only person who's ever going to really understand it. And even if no matter how well you write it, and how much you comment it, there's going to be about 50% of the people that never understand it. And even you are only going to remember it for a couple of months. So our advice is break your scripts up. Try and use the existing steps to compose your actions instead of opening up a script action or opening up an action, dropping a single script step into it, and then writing 1,000 lines of code. The second one, don't repeat yourself. So kind of the whole point of Action Designer is for you to be able to build reusable components. That's how we want you to use the system. So whenever you find yourself dropping the same 3 things into a flow or into a subflow, consider building an action instead, and try to give that, you have the opportunity in Flow Designer to define inputs and outputs. It kind of gives you a nice way to define an API. And you should be able to build reusable components that you can get a lot of functionality out of. So I put in here, like an example is ask for approval. And from a step perspective, ask for approval is kind of a mess, right? Because it seems to break all the rules. It does a lot of things. It's complicated. It waits. But from an action perspective, ask for approval is kind of like the perfect action. It was actually the action that when we were able to build ask for approval as a block, I knew that we had gotten the model right because it needs to do everything. It's extremely complicated.
It needs to sleep, it needs to come back, it needs to rehydrate, it needs to respond to events, it needs to create records that aren't the record you started with, and then wait for those to do stuff, and then reevaluate them and move on. It is the complicated use case that we could prove Flow Designer with.
Right, and so then as an action, it does have kind of a single purpose, right? It's asking for an approval. You can state it right in the name of the thing. And so it takes all of that complexity and it encapsulates it. It's got some simple inputs. It's got some relatively simple inputs, some simple outputs, and you can reuse it all over the place. If it's anything like workflow, it will be one of the most used actions in the system. So this third one, we spent a lot of time, I didn't spend a lot of time, but the UI team spent a lot of time with the natural language feature and the annotations features to make these flows be readable by the average person. And so we want you to use that.
i.e. your boss.
Yes, yes. There was a lot of nitpicking on Slack about, this verbiage should be this, but the end result came out really well. And so it would be nice, or our recommendation is make your actions and your flows be self-documenting. If you follow these first two guidelines of building your actions from existing steps instead of monolithic scripts, and you build custom actions, then you should be able to make some flows that really read well. And you'll be able to have your boss read them, you'll be able to have your boss's boss read them. We built the product so that line of business managers could build their own flows. That was the goal. And so if that's the case, then definitely a technical manager or a director type person should be able to read them and understand what's happening. And as a side benefit, when you have to come back and change it in 2 years, you'll be able to get right in there and know what's going on too. This last one is just kind of, so subflows are new to London, and when I said don't repeat yourself, build an action, I could have in parentheses put or subflow instead. But how do you know whether you want to build an action or a subflow? So from our perspective, the original vision for this was that actions are kind of a piece of a process, but not necessarily something that you would call by itself, right? It's a step of a larger process. It's maybe more complicated than a single step, but it's not the full process either. Whereas a subflow was really thought to be, this is complete and fully usable as it is. I might be using it from multiple places.
Might call it directly, might just include it as part of another flow.
Right. So that was kind of the original definition of what action versus subflow was. But there is, I think we, having built it now and kind of knowing where we're going, there is going to be kind of one or two key differentiators between them. And one is that in the future, subflows will be able to execute as their own independent context. So right now, if you have an action, it's a part of the parent flow. And right now, if you have a subflow, it's a part of the parent flow. But in the future, we're going to support parallel flow execution, and actions will not be able to execute in parallel, but subflows will be able to. So that might push you one way or the other. And then the other thing that's kind of throws all of that theory out the window is actions can't use flow logic. So actions are very linear. They have basically a single path of execution. And if you need to do some conditional branching and have, I want to go down this path in this case, and I want to go down this path in that case, and I want it all wrapped up in a reusable component, that component's going to have to be a subflow.
Right.
All right. So I have a little example here. If we can overcome the technical difficulties of...
We'll have to exit.
That kind of takes all of those guidelines and is an example of how we would suggest building an action. So the scenario here is I have a 12-year-old daughter. I just let her get her first Instagram account. And the rule is she has to tell me when she adds a new friend. So this action is all about creating a new friend. So you can see here, this is the action designer. And I have an action. I called it create a friend monolithic script. And if I hadn't told you what it was just doing, I meant to show it before I told you. I was going to ask, what does this thing do? I was only going to show this part and say, what does this thing do? And the answer is, you have no idea what it does, right? The only way to know what this does is to read the script, which means right away, you rule out anyone who doesn't know script. This is a fairly short script. And I look at it and I say, wow, that's beautiful, clear code. It's well documented. Everybody knows what this means, right? Everybody can read that. And I'm sure that half of you are going, that's awful. Why would anybody do that? It's terrible code. I would never write it that way. And so, this kind of gets back to the idea of, and it's a short script, right? It's only 20 lines of code, and yet it's doing 3 things. This third thing is, does anybody know what that's doing? It's right. It's a notification, but it's the command is event queue. Who would really guess that? It's basically unintuitive. In fact, I had to look it up how to create an event or how to run a notification. So this is basically an example of everything that we don't want you to do. This is kind of the whole point of Flow Designer, is that we wanted you to be able to write this thing this way. So here I've taken those 3 steps, and I'm using the existing out-of-the-box steps. It reads fairly clearly. I can see that I have some inputs. I'm taking a username as a string as an input. You can imagine I could put a service catalog in front of this and map a variable into it, or I could put a script in front of this and I could pass it in. I'm going to create a friend record. You can see clearly what fields I'm going to set. The data panel is actually scrolled off, but you can see over here all the data that I'm moving around. So step 2 is I'm going to take the output of that first step, and I'm going to map it into my second step here. So I'm just going to add my newly created friend record to the friends group. And then I'm going to drop a notification for mom and dad so that we know about it. So this is kind of, the rewritten positive way to do your action. All right. Oh, we got to go back to here.
Nope.
Oh, nope. PowerPoint challenged.
All right.
Yeah, give me the next one. All right.
Before we move too far, any questions about?
Yeah. If anybody has any questions as we're going, wants clarification, just interrupt. Feel free to interrupt. Which bits are in London?
Oh, as far as what's in Kingston versus London?
I think subflows are London, and the mid stuff, which we haven't gotten to yet, is London. I think everything else is Kingston.
There's some UI cleanup that's been done in London as well, but that has to do with how you look at a whole flow.
All right, so let's talk for a second about how the data moves through the system. So all of these components we've been talking about, flows, subflows, actions, they all accept inputs and produce outputs. And that data is kind of scoped to the container that that component is in the sense that steps can use their actions inputs, and they can use any previous steps any steps outputs. I have another diagram, so if that was confusing, don't worry about it. But kind of the point that we want to get across here is that when we if you output data outside of one of those containers, that's when it gets expensive for us. We have to serialize all that data out. Sometimes we end up with multiple copies of it, depending on how it's being used. And so that's kind of a performance issue that you might run into. And it's something that we're actually working on. There was actually a commit went in on Monday that will help this some, and we're hoping to do some more stuff in Madrid. But for now, our recommendation is if you're building an action and you're going to produce a lot of data, and when I say a lot of data, I mean I'm talking like over 500K. So really, what we're in 99.99% of the time, it doesn't matter what you output. But if you have a REST action or a REST step that's pulling back a giant payload, You want to try and process that data within that same action. If you do that, then we can throw it out when you're done with it. So if you can take that 1 gig payload and process it down to the 300K that you actually needed, or the 3 bits of data that you actually needed, we can throw that out. If you output it from your action, then we end up holding on to it for a lot longer. Mm-hmm.
Violate my single responsibility just to not output the data and say that's preferable?
I would say that's preferable for London, yes. But I think by Madrid we'll have that addressed. And yeah, so like as you just said, sometimes that's not possible, right? So in that case, the second part of that is push the generation of that data as late in the flow as possible, and process it as close to generating it as possible. That would be the good.
I think so. One other caveat here about this. As data becomes available at the flow level or within the action level, it gets propagated to the remaining steps that have assigned either steps or actions that are subscribed to it. So if you have an input to the flow, that input will, when the flow starts, if you have 3 actions that all depend on that data, they're all going to get the copy of that input as that flow started at that time. So if it's a glide record, it may update something in the background and you haven't updated a new reference point. So you could find an apparent disconnect between, but at this point in time, it should be this. Well, the data is pushed forward as it's generated so that we don't have data changing on you, through side effects as maybe another step changed something on you. You have to be very explicit in how you pass data through.
Yeah, so I think this might actually, it did not go where I wanted it to go. There we go. All right, so this kind of illustrates what Harry was just talking about. If you think back to that last little block diagram we showed, we had an action, it had a couple steps in it, right? So that's this stripped down. There's no flow. This is just the action part, right? There's a start, 2 steps, and an end. And in the example I showed, we took a username as an input. So that's the input to our action. The first step was to create a record based on that username, so we can map that action's input into the step as an input to that create record step. Now here we have it shown. The second step could also use that same input. It would get pushed to that input at the same time. It didn't actually do that in the example we showed, but it's possible. Go on. So then we had our first step produced a friend record as an output. The output of create record is the output that's created. And then the second one consumed it. So in this case, step 2 has to come after step 1, right? Because there's no way you could have that input before step 1. So in that sense, ordering is available. You can only use the outputs of previous steps in your action. And the UI restricts you on that and tells you if you're doing anything wrong. Our example didn't really have any outputs, but outputs of steps can then be mapped out to become the outputs of the action. So that's just what that last little thing is showing. All right. Was this where you're going to do? Or are we going to go through this?
Yeah, this is it. All right. We have another quick demo to kind of show how it all kind of pieces together at this point. So we've tied in here. Oh, I did that, didn't I? All right, so we're creating a simple use case here. I'm going to build a service catalog item to create a new group within ServiceNow. And I'm going to use Flow Designer to do it. And I'm going to make this larger, reload that. So I've written this create new group service catalog flow here. And you can see on the right, I have the data from the trigger and the trigger is just what starts the flow. It could be a record creation or update when a record meets a state, when, or in this case, we're triggered by the service catalog says, hey, start this flow to deliver this item. First thing we're doing in here, we're pulling out the variables off of that requested item. We're using the actual catalog item as our template here, which gave us the two things from that service catalog that we're looking for. And if I look back really fast at that catalog item, you see there's two questions on here. What's the manager for this new group, and what's the group's name? So those become the output of this action here, which we can see over on the side, group manager, group name. And within Flow Designer, because we have this strong type, we know what these output pills look like. We have the ability to drill into them and extract, okay, I've got a glide record, but I just want this field out of it for the next input for the next thing I want to use it for. First thing I'm going to do, look up to see if the group's already made. If it isn't, then I'm going to continue on. And then at that point, I'm going to ask, is it okay to create this group? If I get approved, then I'm going to log that and then create that group record. Otherwise, I'll log error states indicating what's happening. Now, in the configuration for this item, we've activated it. You have to request, in London is when we have the service catalog integration. You have to request it through ServiceNow. It's not readily available for you. But it's waiting. There it is. So here we have, with the new plugin activated, we have the new field in here to be able to add that flow. So if I try this thing, I'm going to create a new group here for Russ, for his daughter's friends. That, if I could spell.
When you activate that plugin to get flow on the catalog item, is it deactivated workflow?
No, workflow is still there. And I can go back to that.
There are UI policies that'll keep you from setting both, though. So if you set one, it
Yeah, so when we have this here, right, if I don't have it there, then I can select either workflow or execution plan.
Is that plugin a revenue generation?
No, it's just they want the service catalog team wanted to restrict how many people were using it right off the bat because it's their first iteration with us. So,
and that is a London-only feature. That's new to London.
Is the plan to later move more to the flow instead of the workflow, or are you guys going to keep the workflow consistent?
Workflow and orchestration are going to stick around. There's a lot of content you guys have developed. There's a lot of other content that customers are dependent upon. We're not going to get rid of. We're going to continue to support workflow. It's just we want to make an easier user experience to design these things. And with the workflow model and being able to support what's already out there, because you could do anything in workflow. You could do, if you were scripting, but you needed to be a scripting god almost at times to be very, very successful there. So we wanted to make it easier and open that up to more people. And like we said, we want that frontline business owner. We want the process owner to be able to ultimately come down and say, okay, I need a flow that does this, this, and this. So, all right. So that's just adding that. And once I've selected that flow here, workflow and execution plan, they get zeroed out.
So just to be clear, the connection between Service Catalog and Flow Designer is London?
Is London, yes. Yeah. By request. So, yeah.
London by request.
Yeah.
The grid will be there.
That is currently the plan. Like I said, so create this request really fast. You lost it. So I'm going to order that. One thing that I wanted to point out here is within workflow, we execute either within the thread that started it or in the background thread, depending on what happened in the system. It wasn't always quite clear. And often, if a workflow was taking a long time to execute, the service support would say, stick a 1 second timer in there. right? As soon as the flow starts, stick a 1 second time in there. And the goal of that was to get it outside of the user transaction thread, get it into a background schedule worker so that it could take its long time in the background and not be limited by the user UI transaction or make a user wait for a long time for the form to come back. So what we've done in Flow Designer is flows just execute in the background thread. We create an event in a queue, it goes into a background thread and it comes back. So when a user clicks an action that causes a flow to start, it's coming right back. And I can show you how that kind of surfaces in this requested item. So I've got the new requested item that we just ordered for Russ, group name friends, and we can see our approvers down here. So at this point, I can see in my flow execution, right? This is the flow that's delivering that item. We're in a waiting state. We were triggered from the business rule on the requested item. Says once you're approved, start this service catalog. We have extracted our catalog variables from that. Let me refresh this so that it all gets on one screen. It's not. We've zoomed in too far, that's all. All right, so we extracted those catalog variables. We can see within this configuration how we configured this action, and we can see at the runtime what those values looked like. All right, rhythm 1, 007 is the one we just created. If you've composed an action yourself, you can then drill down and see the steps that are internal to that action and see how the data move through them as well. The key here that I want to get to, and we'll come back to the operations view, is that we're in this waiting set. We're waiting for an approval here.
Is that reportable? Is that how I monitor the health of my flows?
There are dashboards. All right, so in here, I'm going to approve. And this is where we're getting down to the point where I said, there's an apparent delay between the user click and the flow actually happening because it's executing in a background thread. And you can see not all these have flipped to not yet required yet, but if I just refresh, there they are. So, and now I can come back to that flow, refresh it, and we'll see everything else has completed. And one of the things that we've really liked about this is not only do we get to see the runtime values of the inputs and what was generated by the different actions and different steps as we move along, we also are capturing the logs. And not just logs generated by Flow Designer, but let's say you've called a script include or another API point, and it's generating logs in that thread while you're running. Those logs are captured and reported here as well. And they're associated with the actual step that was running at the time. You can also just click and look at all the logs that were generated during that execution. All right. Yes? Okay, the question was about the state of the flow itself, the model that you're using to execute. If you're in a waiting state and somebody changes the definition of that flow, does it affect the running flows? The answer is no. When we start the flow, we compile that model down to an internal format, and we use that internal format from there on out. It's actually how we move data through. We annotate that internal format that we use to keep track of the flow itself. It's kind of a compile. It's like the workflow context and the workflow version in one. So.
Looking at performance only, would you recommend customers that have existing workflows upgrade to flows specifically?
It depends on the use case. There are features that you can do in workflow right now that we can't support in Flow Designer in London. There's things we don't have timer, for instance, in London, but it's on our roadmap.
Did you guys publish some of that?
Huh?
With the decision, I mean, maturity going to reach the point where, like, okay, just if you publish when that use case, when I shouldn't use this versus workflow, I will read it and use it.
Okay. We will take that to heart.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Okay, so that was kind of, Harry was showing you the operations view, which if you think back to the very first slide, was the piece on the right-hand side. We're down to like 11 minutes, and I wanted to have time for questions. So I was going to talk a little bit more about the runtime model of this thing. I think I'll just skip this and give you the candy at the end here, which is you got a couple levers that you can pull on this. So Harry alluded to the fact that flows are running asynchronously. And the way that's done is there's an event queue, and there's a certain number of workers that are working on that event queue. So you can see that queue in the Flow Designer application. There's a module called Event Queue. That'll show you everything that's pending. And if you change the filter and put the filter, you can have it show you things that it has done or things that it's working on currently. But as far as tweaking the performance of it, you have a property here that defines the number of workers. Oh, shoot. The number of workers that will be used. And that defaults to 1 per thread per node. There's a couple special values. If you set it to 0, obviously you just said, I want no workers. So we'll keep queuing those events, but nothing will ever chew them down. But if you set it to a negative number, the APIs inside the Flow engine will stop queuing events for you. So
It's basically turning off
yeah.
Flow Designer.
So I mean, we've never seen this in testing. We haven't seen it in Kingston. But if for any reason you had the Flow engine running away and dragging down your instance, that's kind of a lever you can pull to slow it down. It will start eating those down, and now you got to remember, time will have passed. Those records may have changed. The records that it's going to work on may have changed, right? And it's going to get the state of them at the time you turn it back on. So there could be some issues there, but it will chew through all those events, and it should do all the things that it should have done. The other way you can tune it is basically we take the number of jobs you say you want, and then you can say, I want one of those to run every so many seconds. And we just kind of distribute and stagger those jobs so that one should run about that many seconds. Now that's not good. What was that?
How well does that queue work during clones?
During clones?
Is it excluded entirely?
That's a good question.
Yeah, we'll have to get back to you on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So I guess the one thing to remember about frequency, though, is that ultimately this is dependent on the system scheduler. So if your scheduled jobs are backing up, we're going to back up, right? We're just another scheduled job. And so you're kind of requesting frequency, but it's not a guarantee. All right, last piece is mid-server. So this is new to London. And I'm going to show you how this thing runs on the mid-server. The engine is completely independent of Glide. It doesn't depend on the Glide code at all. It can run anywhere. We could, in theory, embed it in your phone if we wanted to. So what happens is the flows always start on the instance. That's just kind of makes sense. So a flow will be running on the instance, and any operation can say, I need to run in a specific environment, with the environment being either the instance or a particular mid-server. And when that happens, the engine stops running the flow, serializes the whole thing, and sends it over to the mid-server. And it'll keep running over there. It'll pick up right where it left off and start running on the mid-server. So it'll keep executing over there until it hits an op that says, I need, in this case, to go back to the instance. And then it'll stop on the mid-server, serialize the whole thing, send it back, and pick up where it left off and start running on the instance again.
You got a question back there?
Quick question. Is there support for mid-server clustering built into this, or does the flow have to be tied to a specific mid-server?
So the way it is right now within IntegrationHub, the mid servers are tied to a connection alias. So it's the actual logic behind which mid it's going to go to is abstracted behind connection aliases. So you can define a connection alias just straight up, and then define, actually, you can declare that connection alias on your development system, and then define it 2 different ways for which of your systems. So the logic that goes into how to pick which mid is all encapsulated within there. So we just call an API point and say, hey, tell me which mid to go to.
It's using the same mid selection criteria, IP ranges, and capabilities and that orchestration uses. So we're basically calling the exact same API. And then if we keep going and we need a different mid server, it'll send it over there. One point is we can't go straight from mid to mid, so you always have to come back to the instance. Even if it's just, if we were, say we were running on mid 1, and we hit an opt that said I need to run on mid 2, it's got to go back to the instance. It'll go right back out. We're not going to start up and then realize, oh, we needed to be on mid 1, and then we got to serialize the whole thing again. It's smart enough to know I got to go right back out, but that transport has to go through the instance every time. So this just kind of are the words behind that diagram. And we looked at a couple different models for how to make the mid-server stuff work, and we ended up picking this because it's pretty simple. I mean, it's a simple, straightforward idea. And it allows, a naive author to build mid steps or actions that use things that need to run on the mid server without really having to know a whole lot about how it works. So that's kind of a pro, but it's also, I think, maybe the biggest con, because it's very possible. If you think about it, you can see how much is going into moving that flow around. It's pretty. If you're not aware of how it's working or what it's doing, you could end up ping-ponging yourself back and forth and cause some performance problems. So if you have some flows that are running so great and they're using the mid server, take a look at those logs and see if you're seeing the log messages that are saying I'm going over to the mid, I'm going back to the instance. If you're doing a REST step that needs to run on a mid server, and then the very next step is a glide record lookup, which obviously has to be done on the instance, and you're doing that inside of a for each loop, well, that's going to be constantly going back and forth. It's going to be spending a lot more time on the plumbing than it is on the actual work. So that's basically how the mid-server stuff works. And then we had kind of the top takeaways for this. Right, so we talked about the best practices for designing flows and actions. Make them self-documenting. Don't make big monolithic scripts. Use the natural language. Don't output data if you can process it within the same action. Get it processed down to the smallest amount of data that you actually need. And then if you're running on mid, be aware of interleaving those glide-only and mid-only steps can cause a lot of back and forth communication between the instance and the mid server, so you got to watch out for that. And that's everything we had.
Thank you.
Is this domain separated?
It is. We don't fully support domain separation at this time. It's on our roadmap as we move forward through Madrid.
It's not in Madrid. We know that.
Yeah, it's not in Madrid at this point. Any other questions? We can answer them over here.